On October 9, 2006, North Korea placed a nuclear device with a yield of 0.5 to 1 kiloton deep beneath a mountain. They detonated it. The entrance collapsed and the ground shook. But for the regime, this was only the beginning. In 2009, they placed another charge under the same mountain, this time between 2 and 7 kilotons. Another blast. And again, the North Koreans claimed it wasn't enough. Then came several increasingly powerful tests, and finally in 2017, the DPRK detonated a 100 to 250 kiloton charge under that very same peak, a blast far more powerful than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The explosion triggered a magnitude 6.1 earthquake, a massive seismic event. The shock was felt as far as 600 miles away. Yet North Korea was reportedly severely disappointed. They'd expected the mountain to literally disintegrate under the country's nuclear might, but nothing of the sort happened. And this is the North Pacific, roughly 500 miles southwest of San Diego. In 1955, a 30-kiloton Mk-90 Betty was detonated here, and this led to basically nothing. Nuclear bombs have been detonated directly within seismic fault lines, and again without serious consequences. How do mountains, seas, and the Earth itself manage to withstand such violence? And what would happen if you dropped a nuclear bomb right into a volcano? Today, we're going to look into this. Resilient mountains. First, a quick explanation. What actually happens during a nuclear explosion? It's a blinding flash where the energy locked inside atomic nuclei is unleashed in a fraction of a second. Temperatures soar into the millions of degrees, the surrounding matter ceases to be solid or gas and momentarily transforms into plasma. A shockwave first compresses everything around it with extreme force, then violently hurls it outward. In an open environment, the energy spreads freely, creating a fireball followed by that iconic mushroom cloud silhouette. To contain that kind of fury, concrete and high-tech bunkers aren't enough. You need sheer mass, something capable of absorbing the blow, deforming without shattering, and swallowing the momentum. Something heavy, dense, and resilient. Mount Mantap in North Korea turned out to be the perfect candidate for this role. It was formed over millions of years by tectonic and other processes. In the end, North Korea ended up with a massive mountain peak made of granite, basalt, and other less important rock layers. And the key here is the basalt and granite. They're extremely strong. On top of that, basalt and granite are heavy. 35 cubic feet of this rock weighs almost 3 tons. Now imagine a mountain that's millions of cubic feet, millions of tons of rock, and none of it wants to move, so the blast energy is focused on trying to shove and tear that mass apart. In other words, nature basically built a perfect cage for a nuclear device. And to be fair, the North Koreans helped too. They carved horizontal tunnels through the mountain, 6 to 10 feet wide. These tunnels ran for hundreds of feet, driving deep into the rock toward chambers where the nuclear charges were placed. The entrances to the system sat at roughly 4,600 feet above sea level, while the chambers themselves were about 1,600 to 2,600 feet below the summit. The thicker the rock overhead at the detonation point, the higher the chance that energy stays trapped inside instead of breaking out. So the whole thing functioned like a natural high-pressure shell, where an enormous mass of stable granite and basalt took the hit and damped it within the mountain. During all the explosions, you could clearly see the mountain geology was doing its job, especially during the last and most powerful test, estimated at 150 to 200 kilotons. That time, North Korea recorded an earthquake of magnitude 6.1, and seismic stations even picked it up in Japan. Inside the mountain, of course, there was local damage. After each detonation, the damage zone expanded. Cracks spread farther from the epicenter, and the surface sagged in places. The massive slowly built up fatigue, like a body taking repeated punches in the same spot. Still, the main granite skeleton held together, supporting the upper layers and preventing a sudden violent release of energy to the outside. Even so, American and Chinese researchers reached the same conclusion. Mount Mantap suffered serious internal damage, and it probably wouldn't have survived continued testing, as even it has its limits. Speaking of the US, this country also has mountains that withstood nuclear explosions too. When the United States began moving away from atmospheric nuclear tests, a simple and tough problem appeared: find a place where the energy could be kept underground. That's how the Nevada test site was born, an area of Nevada desert that turned into a network of underground laboratories hidden beneath plateaus and mountain blocks. A key location was Rainier Mesa, a high plateau at about 7,500 feet above sea level. This is where so-called mountain tests were concentrated, tests that relied on the thickness of rock around the device. The tunnels at Rainier Mesa ran hundreds of feet into the rock. They were designed not only to place nuclear devices, but also as a measurement infrastructure. Side galleries housed instruments that recorded neutron and gamma radiation, heat pulses, and how the shockwave moved through the rock. The first fully contained underground detonation in the Rainier Mesa area took place in 1957. And from 1957 to 1992, the Plateau's tunnels hosted more than 60 underground nuclear tests. As the years went by, studies showed a clear pattern of rock fatigue. Zones of loosening form inside, crack networks grow, and the overall stiffness of the rock decreases. At the same time, there were no recorded cases of uncontrolled collapse, the massive splitting open, or energy venting to the surface. The plateau continued to hold, and that's despite it being much weaker than the mountain in North Korea. To be fair though, the yield of those tests never exceeded 20 kilotons of TNT equivalent. That's far below the levels North Korea later demonstrated. So yes, mountains can handle nuclear explosions quite well, even if they eventually get tired. But is there anything on Earth that can handle nuclear blasts even better? Yes, and this test environment can handle both the radiation and the blast energy without major issues. Ocean doesn't care. Let's start with a short, obvious fact. There's a lot of water in the world's oceans. About 71% of the Earth's surface is covered by the ocean. And of course, people have tried to blow things up in it more than once, but the attempts that became truly famous were the ones carried out by the United States in the middle of the last century. The Pacific is an endless mass of water, no edges, no horizon line you can trust. People looked at it and started asking all kinds of questions, like what happens to a submarine if a nuclear blast goes off nearby without hitting it directly? That question led to Operation Wigwam, one standalone experiment run by the U.S. Navy together with the Atomic Energy Commission. Around 6,500 to 6,800 people took part, along with roughly 30 ships, submarines, measurement vessels, and support ships. They used a Mk-90 Betty device with a yield of about 30 kilotons, roughly comparable to the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The main difference was the setting. This one wasn't detonated in the air or near the surface. They sent it far down, to a depth of roughly 2,000 feet, where the ocean stops being scenery and physics becomes punishing. Almost no light reaches that far, the pressure's brutal, and the only animals down there are the ones built for harsh conditions. After the detonation, observers on ships several miles from the epicenter saw no fireball, no mushroom cloud, none of the usual nuclear signatures. The surface rose slightly, then a broad wave rolled outward. A few seconds later, a dome of spray and water mist appeared, and then everything slowly settled as the haze dispersed. Imagine standing on deck knowing a nuclear bomb just went off beneath you, and yet the surface doesn't look like something world-changing just happened. At this point, you could say the ocean couldn't care less about what humans decide to detonate inside it, but down in the depths, things were far more interesting. Water barely compresses, so the main weapon wasn't heat, it was pressure. At the blast point, a gigantic bubble of superheated gases and steam formed and expanded rapidly to a radius of roughly 360 to 390 feet, then collapsed. And then it did it again, several times, on a cycle of about 2.5 to 3 seconds. Each pulse sent a powerful pressure impulse through the water, traveling for miles. Those pressure pulses were the whole point of the test. In the test zone, they placed submarine hull sections, mock-ups, and target chips packed with sensors measuring pressure and deformation. At close range, the shockwave bent metal, shifted bulkheads, and tore equipment off its mounts. At mid-range, hulls could look almost intact. But inside, everything failed. Instruments broke, and the overloads made crew survival extremely doubtful. Still, if you set aside damage to man-made underwater targets, the ocean made it clear that it wasn't particularly bothered by this kind of test. In Wigwam, there was no serious radioactive contamination. The reason was simple. The blast bubble never reached the surface. Fission products didn't shoot into the air, didn't settle on ships, and didn't turn the decks into death traps. Most of the radionuclides stayed at depth and were quickly diluted by currents in the ocean's enormous volume. Measurements showed that about 90% of participants received a recorded radiation dose of 0. But what if you place a nuclear device higher up, closer to the surface? Would the ocean still be so indifferent? In 1946, Bikini Atoll in the Pacific was emptied. Residents were relocated, and the U.S. launched Operation Crossroads, an experiment not about impressive flashes, but about a blunt, practical question. What happens to a fleet if a nuclear blast occurs nearby? There were 2 tests, Able, an airburst, and Baker, an underwater detonation. and it was the second one that turned out to be the most revealing. A nuclear device with a yield of about 23 kilotons was lowered to just 88 feet below the lagoon surface. It was suspended on cables beneath a landing ship that had been turned into a fixed platform. Dozens of decommissioned and captured ships were arranged around it so the impact would hit from every direction. Then came the blast. Underwater, a huge bubble of superheated gas formed and surged through the lagoon, forcing the water aside. Then the bubble broke through the surface, and a column of steam, water, coral sand, and shipwreck shot out of the ocean. And then everything that rose up came crashing down again with a heavy roar. The battleship USS Arkansas, weighing about 27,000 tons, was yanked upward, then thrown hard to one side and almost immediately rolled over. Water poured into the hull, and soon the massive ship settled on the lagoon floor. Smaller vessels behaved differently. Some were torn apart by the shock wave, others were thrown clear out of the water, then slammed back down, lost stability, and sank. And then the radiation remained, an invisible film coating the ships. It seeped into metal, paint, and the wood of decks and bulkheads. Levels reached thousands of Roentgens per hour, doses that can kill a person almost instantly. In the first years after the test, some families did return to the atoll, but it quickly became clear the radiation hadn't gone anywhere. It lingered in the soil, the water, the plants. Radioactive elements accumulated in food and settled across the islands. In 1978, people were evacuated again. Permanent resettlement was deemed impossible. For decades, the atoll remained nearly empty. Even today, almost 80 years after the blasts, it's visited mostly by tourists and divers. So how did the ocean react? Well, in a different way this time. In the first days after the explosion, the lagoon water in the area around the ships were heavily contaminated. Then it all changed. Some isotopes had short half-lives and lost activity quickly. Heavier particles settled to the bottom or were diluted by moving ocean water outside the lagoon. Over the following weeks and months, radiation levels in the water dropped noticeably, and it could be used for short technical operations. Over time, the ocean's self-cleaning worked so effectively that in recent years, UNESCO registered that radiation levels in the lagoon's surface water and the surrounding sea are close to natural background comparable to other parts of the Pacific and do not pose a serious threat for brief visits or swimming. There's another surprising detail. Surveys recorded around 183 types of coral organisms on the local reefs, and roughly 70% of coral communities recovered after the tests. Near the sunken ships, corals grew into massive structures, and fish and other species used these islands as permanent habitat, even in places where radiation concentrations were once enormous. So we've learned that mountains and oceans don't really care about nuclear explosions. But what if we turn to a far more dangerous natural creation? For example, what if we detonate a nuclear bomb in a place where the Earth is already hazardous, even without humans and their experiments? Not what everyone expected. In the last century, the United States was looking for a place to detonate a nuclear device underground. They needed a location that was geologically risky, and they found it. Amchitka Island in Alaska, on the Aleutian Arc. To put it mildly, the place isn't calm. The ground is always on the move, and most importantly, there are fault lines that made it convenient to drill and set a device, and it gave scientists a chance to see whether a blast could force a fault to widen. Some experts warned about worst-case outcomes from the start. They talked about the possibility of major earthquakes, tsunamis, and the idea that the explosion's energy could interfere with the tectonics of the Aleutian Arc. It sounded like exactly the kind of place where you shouldn't bury nuclear bombs. Yet, in 1969, preparations began for a test called Milrow. Milrow's yield was about 1 megaton, roughly 1,000 kilotons, several times larger than North Korea's 2017 underground test. The device was lowered to a depth of around 4,000 feet. For an underground detonation, depth is everything. It determines whether the surrounding rock contains the energy or vents it to the surface. In the first moments after the blast, the ground above the epicenter actually lifted. Then, about 37 hours later, the underground cavity failed and collapsed, leaving a crater several feet deep. After that, the Earth didn't settle down quickly. Seismologists recorded hundreds of small local jolts, usually under a magnitude 4, over the following hours and days. These weren't classic tectonic earthquakes so much as the sounds of damage, the cavity crumbling, stress redistributing, rock trying to find a new balance. But the experiments weren't over. 2 years later, on November 6, 1971, it was time for Kinnikin, the most powerful underground nuclear explosion in U.S. history. Its yield was about 5 megatons, roughly 400 times the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. This device was placed even deeper, about 5,870 to 6,100 feet, to keep the energy underground and reduce radioactive venting. The effects were massive, even by underground test standards. A huge cavity formed below the surface and partially collapsed about 38 hours later. After Cannikin, a subsidence crater formed up to 1 mile across and around 52 feet deep. Over time, it filled with water, becoming what's now known as Cannikin Lake. The blast also shifted the local landscape in subtler ways. Some creeks and lakes changed course. Slopes and drainage patterns were altered by underground deformation. A few ponds even drained completely as water escaped through newly opened cracks. The seismic wave was so strong that distance stations recorded it as an event roughly equivalent to a magnitude 7.0 on the Richter scale. And yes, there's something almost nobody planned for. The test had a huge impact on local wildlife. Studies reported that Cannikin killed 700 to 2,000 sea otters in the Bering Sea due to shock waves and pressure changes in the water. Still, those expert worst-case scenarios remain just that, scenarios. The devices were enormous and the signals were powerful, but in reality, despite local deformation and strong seismic effects, no large-scale tectonic catastrophe was observed. The ground shook, and then it stopped. And now, after all those insane tests, how do you feel about the idea of setting off a nuclear device inside something that's already a disaster waiting to happen? Madness with a wild ending. Volcanoes are one of those forces of nature humanity has never truly controlled. They just build pressure over years, decades, sometimes centuries, and then they remind everyone who's in charge. In 79 CE, Mount Vesuvius wiped Pompeii and Herculaneum off the map in a matter of hours. People fled without really understanding what was happening until their city was simply gone. In 1815, Tambora in Indonesia erupted with such staggering force that the following year went down in history as the year without summer. Crops failed, famine spread, and temperatures dropped around the world. And none of that has gone away. Yellowstone, Etna, Merapi, Popocatépetl, these volcanoes are alive, active, and sitting uncomfortably close to cities, highways, and power plants. We can evacuate, forecast, install sensors, but we can't stop a firestorm once it's unleashed. A volcano is pressure and energy, and we have the most powerful weapon ever created. So the question naturally comes up, could you blow it up? Release the pressure, intervene, do something. But it's not that simple. Dropping a nuclear device straight into the crater of an active volcano is basically impossible. The temperatures are extreme, the rock is unstable, and gases are constantly venting. No equipment, let alone a nuclear device, could reliably survive those conditions, and even if it could, placing the charge precisely where it would matter is unrealistic. Essentially, if a volcano is already erupting, the best plan is to run. If we're talking about a volcano that isn't erupting yet, but is active and building pressure, it still doesn't get easier. To deliver a device, you'd have to drill or carve a path into the volcanic system. That kind of intervention is dangerous by itself. Disturbing fractures, shifting pressure, or changing fluid flow could trigger an eruption prematurely. That's why in theoretical discussions, a more cautious idea sometimes appeared, placing a device not in the crater and not inside the volcano, but in the surrounding rock near the suspected magma chamber. No one seriously expected to blow up a volcano. That's too blunt and too naive. The conversation was about a different kind of effect, trying to interfere with a system that's already near a tipping point. Not to shatter it, but to nudge it like a massive mechanism. Imagine a volcano not as a mountain with a crater, but as a complicated internal machine, a magma chamber, feeder channels, gas pockets, and pressure zones. Now picture a short, incredibly powerful burst of energy slamming into that system. What scientists first pinned their hopes on was rock mechanics. An underground blast creates a zone of extreme compression around it, followed by a web of cracks. Those cracks don't have to be huge. Sometimes microscopic shifts are enough to make magma and gases take different routes. One conduit tightens, another opens slightly, and the whole pressure distribution scheme inside the volcano changes. The second hope was placed on volume. Cavities and decompressed zones might form around the magma chamber. Yes, small and temporary, but they still give magma extra room to expand. In theory, that would lower peak pressure, the moment when the system either releases energy gradually or ruptures upward in an explosive eruption. The third factor was seismic effects. The shockwave from an underground blast acts like an artificial earthquake. Vibrations travel through the chamber, the conduits, the gas-rich zones, and gas in magma is the key. Change the degassing regime and you change everything. The magma might become less viscous and less explosive, or it might start behaving in ways it never did before. It all makes sense until physics and basically every other field of science says no. For one thing, you can't aim the energy of an explosion neatly into the magma chamber. A blast only affects a limited volume of rock around the detonation point. Most of the energy just dissipates and never reaches the zones where an eruption is actually built. And as we've learned, an underground blast isn't a joke. It can cause real local damage, like killing animals living nearby. And that's from the seismic wave alone. A nuclear detonation adds radiation on top of that, and radiation can reach the surface through multiple pathways. And then there's raw power, or rather the vast gap between what we can do and what nature does. Take the Tsar Bomba, the most powerful nuclear weapon ever detonated at roughly 50 to 58 megatons. Humanity has never set off anything more powerful. Meanwhile, the 1883 Krakatoa eruption is often estimated at around 200 megatons. The Tambora eruption in 1815 is estimated at roughly 800 to 1,000 megatons. A brief impulse doesn't discharge a system like that. It either barely affects it or perturbs the system randomly. Cracks formed after a blast don't follow a plan. Instead of safely redistributing pressure, they can create new pathways for magma and gas, including in unexpected, dangerous directions. And finally, there's a hard foundational uncertainty. Nobody can know exactly where the magma chamber is, how it's shaped, or what state it's in at the moment you intervene. Any miscalculation turns a controlled experiment into a risk of triggering an uncontrolled eruption. That's why the idea stayed on paper and never moved beyond theoretical discussion. Can you imagine someone deciding that cooling Yellowstone with a nuclear bomb is a brilliant plan? I'd rather not. In short, the idea is insane. Still, can anyone really guarantee it could never happen? There were times when the idea of nuclear blasts under mountains, underwater, and along fault lines seemed insane too.